Hello there, squirrels. Here I am after 11. Got a caramel in my mouth, doggone it. Get rid of it. Look, I started a new pattern. It's not my stitch. Woohoo! Very easy, one row repeat, double crochets. But hey, it's something different. Okay, it's still there, but maybe it won't be too bad. I didn't go back to see exactly where I left off, so I was so sleepy. Y'all know. And the electric light was a greater novelty than it is now, and the guests were loud in their admiration of the fairy palace appearance of the house as they approached, and of its brilliance within. Mr. Stackpole was as delighted as a child with a new toy, and led his friends about, showing them how by merely turning a button on the wall he could plunge a room in darkness or flood it with radiant light. Dancing was kept up with a great spirit till the small hours, and as the clock in the hall chimed 3:15, the old house resounded to the half-sad and wholly romantic strains of a waltz by somebody. The guests who came from a distance had begun to depart, and Mr. Beaumont stood on the porch, laughingly seeing Lady Jane Grey and Flora MacDonald into their carriage. Just then a maid gave a message to one of the footmen to Mrs. Beaumont, who sat fanning herself near the door of the ballroom. "If you please, ma'am, nurse says Master Harry is awake and crying with the music, and says he won't go to sleep till he sees you, ma'am." "Tell nurse I will come directly," and excusing herself to the lady who sat next to her, she slipped out of the room. In the hall she met her father as he was entering his study. "I'm going to put this miserable encumbrance by," he said, smiling and nourishing the Admiral's cocked hat, which he had gallantly carried the whole evening, to his great inconvenience. "And I'm on the way to the nursery to see little Harry." And Mrs. Beaumont ran upstairs, softly singing to the sweet music that floated from the ballroom. Mr. Stackpole laid his hat on the table and looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. 3:15. I'm tired. And the young people ought to be. Hey-ho. I'd rather give 10 dinners than one dance. And he yawned profoundly, sank into a low chair by the fire, stretched his legs out before him, and closed his eyes. Sleep fell upon him instantly, and for several minutes he was lost in its depths. Light and sound had ceased to exist for him. His brain was steeped in silent darkness. Mr. Beaumont still stood in the porch. The servants had returned to the house, and he was alone. It was a mild winter's night. He flung a cloak over his matador's costume and stepped into the open air. "I shan't be missed for 5 minutes," he said to himself, "while I smoke a cigarette." And he walked briskly along a broad path some 30 yards from the house, from which he had a perfect view of the front of Harbleton Hall. And very pretty its cheery brightness looked against the dark background of a star-set night. Brilliant rays of light shot from the undraped windows, and those that had the blinds drawn down showed the outline of objects in the room thrown upon them in shadow as clearly as from a magic lantern. Involuntarily he raised his eyes to the window of Mrs. Stackpole's sitting room and stood rooted to the spot. 2 figures as clearly defined as silhouettes were visible on the pure square of the blind. The shadows of an old man and a young man struggling together. From the shape of the heads, George Beaumont saw that they wore tie wigs, and there was the clearly cut shadow of the ruffles at the wrist, and the younger and taller man wore a large Steinkirk with richly laced ends round his neck. At first he thought they were guests dressed in the costume of the early Georgian period, though how they had gone upstairs into that room, or why there was a deadly struggle between them, he did not know. But wonder and speculation was swallowed up in a terrified interest as he watched the course of the brief conflict. The elder and shorter man, who stooped considerably, appeared to be unarmed, and seized the younger man by the throat. When he shook himself free, stepped quickly back, drew his sword, and plunging forward on his right foot, ran his opponent through the body. He staggered backward and fell out of the sight below the level of the window, and there remained only the shadow of the younger man in clear profile on the blind. He stood for a minute looking downward, and George Beaumont had time to observe the finely cut figures of a total stranger. Then he saw he wiped the blade of the sword, turned, and walked away, and his shadow passed out of sight, leaving the window blind a blank, luminous square. Indoors at the same time, Mr. Stackpole had been waked from his short sleep by a sound in his wife's sitting room overhead, and he sprang to his feet with every faculty concentrated and listening. A noise as if chairs pushed back and upset on the polished floor, and a scuffling of feet, as though two men were struggling together. Then a moment of silence, a loud stamp and heavy fall that seemed to shake the ceiling, followed by deep groans. "Good God, what can be the matter?" It says "grod," cried Mr. Stackpole, and he rushed from the room into the hall. The front door stood open, though the inner glass doors were closed, and neither his son-in-law nor any of the servants were there. He stopped to call nobody, but ran upstairs to his wife's room just as his daughter came quickly down from the story above with a white and terrified face. "Oh, Papa, someone has just frightened me so, but whoever he is in there. I saw him go into Mama's room a few minutes ago, and I'm so glad you've come, for I dare not follow him." And without asking Ella of whom she was speaking, Mr. Stackpole flung the door wide open and rushed into the room. No one was there, not a chair or table displaced, and the electric light illuminating every corner of the room forbade the possibility of anybody being in hiding. "It's the most extraordinary thing," he exclaimed, wiping the perspiration of terror from his brow as he spoke. "I would not have your mother know of it for the world." "Have you seen him too?" said his daughter faintly. "Seen whom, my child? Seen what?" "No, I've seen nothing, but I heard enough to last me my lifetime. God forbid that I should hear it again." And he looked about the room and under the table, fairly stupefied with amazement. "He passed me on the stairs just as I came out of the night nursery," said Mrs. Beaumont, anxious to tell her experience without waiting to hear her father's. "A tall young man ran quickly by me, dressed in a blue coat with ruffles at the wrist and a great laced cravat, and a wig tied with a ribbon at the back. He carried a long, thin sword in his hand. At first I thought it was Arthur Newton, who wore a powdered wig like his this evening, but I remembered his coat was black, and he left early. When I saw his face, it was a stranger's, and he looked cruel and passionate. I followed him till I saw him go into this room and shut the door after him." "Then where the devil is he now?" said Mr. Stackpole. "This is some miserable practical joke, but I'll get to the bottom of it." and be even with them yet. I'll get to the bottom of it. I know we've already said that, but it's there again. And as he spoke, the door that he had taken the precaution to close burst open, and his son-in-law entered in his matador's dress, pale and breathless, looking as if the bull had turned and given him chase. "Oh, George, have you seen him too?" said his wife. "Did you hear anything?" asked Mr. Stackpole. "Sit down, man. You're trembling like a leaf. There were two of them, an old man and a young man, in this room a minute ago. In God's name, who were they, and why did you not stop them before murder was done?" he said excitedly. Mr. Stackpole grew quiet and self-collected at the sight of his son-in-law's agitation. "Pull yourself together, George, and tell me what you mean." "There is something up tonight that needs explaining. But where are they? They were in this room, and if you were with them, you must have witnessed what happened, or if you only came upstairs just now, you must have met the young man leaving the room. The old man will never stir again," and he lifted the tablecloth and looked under the table. "How come you spoke confidently of who was in this room a few minutes ago when you were downstairs all the while?" asked Mr. Stackpole. "I was smoking a cigarette in the garden after seeing the Westons off, walking on the broad path, and when I looked up at Mama's sitting room window and saw the shadow of two men on the blind, shown up by the electric light as clear and sharp as in a magic lantern. I saw their profiles perfectly, but I did not know their faces. They wore wigs tied behind and ruffles at the wrist, and the younger, taller man, as I saw by his shadow, wore a laced Steinkirk round his neck. They struggled together, and the old man grasped the young man by the throat, but he tore himself free, drew his sword, and ran him through the body. He fell below the level of the window out of my sight." Excuse me. "And the younger man stood for a minute, wiped his sword, then moved away, and left the blind a blank sheet of white." "Good God, and I heard it all in my room below, the struggle and the fall and deep groans," said Mr. Stackpole. "And I met the young man if it was anything human, and he passed me on the stairs," said his daughter, seizing her father by the arm. "Oh, Papa, Harbleton Hall is haunted. People were right about it. Do let us leave this dreadful place tomorrow." And the concluding notes of the sad, whatever it is, waltz sighed through the house as she spoke. Mr. Stackpole shook his head. "I don't see how that is to be done, for your mother must not be frightened. For heaven's sakes, try to look at it as if nothing happened. We shall be missed downstairs. I'll go, and you two must manage to bid our guests good night decently, and not to alarm those who remain till tomorrow. We must rouse no suspicions, George. Fetch Ella a glass of champagne. It will do her good." "Oh, don't leave me alone," cried Mrs. Beaumont, like a frightened child. "Then I will send wine up for both of you," said her father. "And mind, you must follow me directly." Mr. Stackpole rejoined his guests, who had not missed him, and were in the midst of the last dance with as much freshness and enjoyment as if it had been the first of the evening. At length all the guests had departed except those composing the house party, and the ladies soon retired, leaving the gentlemen to have a smoke in the billiard room. "You don't look very well, Beaumont," said a young man dressed as a Tyrolean peasant, as he lit a cigar and looked up at his friend's pale face. "It's nothing, only waltzing makes me giddy," and he mixed himself some brandy and soda. One by one, the guests bade good night and left the room until there only remained Mr. Stackpole, his son-in-law, and Mr. Liston, a gentleman with very long legs, wearing tights to display them to advantage. "Did your father-in-law know when he took Harbleton Hall that it was supposed to be haunted?" he said in a low voice to Mr. Beaumont. Mr. Stackpole happened to hear the question and replied to it himself. "We heard some foolish gossip on the subject, for of course no place stands empty so long without legends being invented to account for the fact, but I'm not the man to listen to vulgar chatter. I took the house and have been highly delighted with it," and Mr. Beaumont could only admire his father-in-law's admirable self-possession. "Just so, and the electric light is the true cure for the supposed supernatural. Of course you know how suddenly Sir Rowland Shaw, is that what his name was? Well, he's changing his name, I think, left the place." "Oh, yes, we've heard all about that," said Mr. Stackpole, forcing a laugh. "Do you know, I doubt whether you've ever heard all about it. At least if you have, you must be a cheerful sort of person if you can laugh at it," said Mr. Liston. "Why, of course the whole thing was a foolish practical joke, something connected with the magic lantern, if I remember rightly." "Magic lantern? I never even heard the word mentioned. No, if you care to hear the truth about it, I think I can tell you. I've lived in the county all my life, and I know the story of Harbleton Hall by heart. I only wonder you don't. I should not tell you now if I thought it would make you nervous, but since you've put in the electric light and done up the house in such cheerful modern style, the whole place has changed, and anyone might enjoy living here." "Let us hear the story," said Mr. Stackpole abruptly. "I see I've roused your curiosity. The story goes that some 150 years ago there lived in this house a certain father and son who hated one another like the devil. And it's needless to say that there was a woman in the case and a fortune at stake. The old man must have been an uncommonly bad... The old man must have been an uncommonly bad lot, and he is said to have grossly insulted the young lady his son was about to marry, having in the first instance proposed to her himself and been refused. The two men had a deadly quarrel about it in this very house, and the upshot was that the son, mad with passion, ran his father through the heart and killed him on the spot. There, I shan't say anything more about it if it's too much for you," said Mr. Liston, struck by the white faces before him. Go on," said Mr. Stackpole. "Well, one winter's night, now 8 years ago, as Mr. Sir Rowland Shaw was coming home late, walking across the garden, he looked up at the window of the room on the first floor, where a light was burning, and he saw in the blind in clear outline the shadows of the old man and his son struggling together, and he saw the young man run his father through the body with his rapier. I cannot bear it, said George Beaumont, pale as death and looking ready to faint. You could but say that if you had seen the grim shadows yourself. It certainly is a horrid story, and though I can't say that I believe in ghosts myself, I can offer no explanations of the details I've given you. Sir Rowland believed it, and he was clear-headed, a matter-of-fact sort of person. Other members of the family, too, saw and heard unaccountable things that night. One of the sons, who was sitting up late for his father, met the shadow of an evil-looking fellow dressed in a blue coat and wearing a powdered tie wig, hurrying along an upper passage carrying a naked rapier in his hand. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Let's see. Let's see if we can get a pronunciation. Oh, come on, highlight it. Nope, it's not going to work. Oh, well. I've heard of it before, but I can't remember. It's, the sword. And Lady Shaw was waked by a sound in the room next hers, which was the room where the shadows were seen on the blind. A sound of struggling and upsetting of chairs, followed by a heavy fall and deep groans. Now, if only one person had thought that he had heard or seen unaccountable things, Sir Rowland would have made the best of it and stayed on at Harbleton Hall. But, by Jove, when 3 rational beings are each an eye and ear witness, it becomes intolerable. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, you can't put up with a thing like that. By heaven, you can't, that's true, said Mr. Stackpole, wiping his moist brow. And now, Liston, that you have told me this, I'll tell you something in return. I and my family leave Harbleton Hall tomorrow for the precise reason that drove Sir Rowland Shaw out of it 8 years ago. Never! As sure as I'm alive, we leave here tomorrow. I must find some reason for our sudden flight, but go we must. And I cannot have my wife alarmed. I would not spend another night in this house for the world, said Beaumont. Ain't hurting them. But, my dear Mr. Stackpole, I hope that nothing that I've said leads you to make this extraordinary resolution. Your imagination is excited by what you've heard. There cannot possibly be any cause why you should leave this charming place that you have just fitted up to your own taste, said Mr. Liston soothingly. The story you have told us has only helped to explain what we already know. I tell you that this very night, not a couple of hours ago, in the blaze of the electric light, and with the house full of company, Beaumont, my daughter, and myself have seen and heard the sights and sounds that drove Sir Rowland Shaw out of Harbleton Hall, and we leave tomorrow, or rather today, for it's nearly 6 o'clock. Now never to spend another night under this accursed roof, and Mr. Stackpole's voice shook as he spoke. I have only to request, he added, that you will treat this communication as strictly confidential, for neither Beaumont nor I shall care to speak or to be spoken to about what has occurred tonight. Where was Mr. Stackpole's intelligent curiosity on the subject of ghosts, and what had become of his courage? The one had been satisfied and the other daunted, and he had not the slightest desire to remain and investigate the mystery. At late breakfast, Mr. Stackpole was shocked by the appearance of Mrs. Stackpole was shocked by the appearance of her family. It would have been difficult to say which was most pale and haggard, her husband, her daughter, or son-in-law. They made the poor excuse that late hours did not suit them, and that dancing knocked them up. And she told them that they looked like very young children who'd been to their first pantomime the night before. When the last guest was gone, Mrs. Stackpole saw that there was something seriously disturbing her husband, and was at a loss to account for his changed humor. My dear, we will go up to town this afternoon with George and Ella, he said, with a quick decision. "Impossible," replied his wife calmly. "You, of course, can go if you like, but I really cannot." "Oh, do come with us, Mama. You know how much Papa wishes it," said her daughter. "Yes, do come with us," urged her son-in-law with unwonted ardor. "It is so long since we met," forgetting that they had spent the last month together. Mrs. Stackpole laughed. "There's evidently some deep-laid plot among you three to hurry me off. Well, if you will be any the happier for my coming with you, I'll do so, though it's most inconvenient to leave home in this sudden way," said the good-tempered lady. And they travelled up to London that day, never to return to Harbleton Hall. Mr. Stackpole so managed that his wife did not know his real reason for giving up the most charming house they had ever lived in. He preferred that she should attribute it to his restlessness and caprice. Anything rather than her nerves should be shaken by hearing the truth. He consulted a fashionable physician, first giving him a hint that he wished to be ordered off to the south of France immediately, and the hint being taken, he told his long-suffering wife that Dr. Blank had recommended him go abroad at once, and in 2 days they were en route for Marseille. Mrs. Stackpole was accustomed to her husband's impulsive, angular movements, so that it did not greatly disturb her, but a week later he said he had decided to give up Harbleton Hall and to look for a place somewhere in the eastern counties, which were as yet untrodden ground to him. She shed tears of present disappointment and prospective fatigue when the much enduring lady had dried her eyes and her husband had enumerated to her in detail every reason but the real one for which he was leaving their beautiful home. She said, "My dear, if I did not know better, I should be forced to believe you too had seen the ghost that frightened Sir Roland Shaw out of Harbleton Hall 8 years ago." And that's it. That is all. And we'll stop there. But I have some Thanksgiving stories. You folks that have not been, I guess you're not here. But classic Thanksgiving stories. Louisa May Alcott is one of the authors. And these probably come from some stories we've already read. L.M. Montgomery, O. Henry, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Louisa May Alcott, George Eliot, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. So there it is. So hopefully, I don't know, I'm not sure how long the stories are, but it may not take us all the way through the month, but we'll just read and see. I just wanted some good, heartwarming, classic Thanksgiving stories. I wish you could see that. It's quite pretty. Let's see if I turn all these lights off and do this. You can kind of see it. I'll see y'all. Love you. Love you bunches. Tomorrow, Whip Wednesday. And I have a little show. And still have a million do-rags to finish. And this little teeny weeny hat that stretches a bunches from this teeny tiny yarn. It's like thread. Whips, whips, everywhere I look, and I have a yarnable to open and yarn nut. Yarn nut yarn by Gia. Don't be an idiot. Shop yarn nut. Love y'all bunches. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.